The small country church was filled long before the ceremony began, wooden pews creaking under the weight of curious guests dressed in their finest clothes. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the aisle, but the warmth of the light did nothing to ease the tension hanging in the air. At the front stood the bride, calm and graceful, her hands folded gently at her waist. She wore a simple white dress, elegant but modest, and a delicate veil framed her face. Her eyes were bright, not with nervousness, but with quiet determination. She could not hear the murmurs spreading through the room, but she could feel them. The way people looked at her, the way some leaned closer to whisper, the way others smirked when they thought no one was watching. She had grown up learning to read faces the way others read words. A raised eyebrow, a tight smile, a glance exchanged between two guests told her more than sound ever could. She knew what they were thinking. A deaf girl marrying a wealthy rancher. It didn't make sense to them. In their minds, she was fragile, broken, someone who should be pitied, not celebrated. They didn't see the strength it took for her to stand here, after years of being underestimated, ignored, or treated like a burden. Near the middle rows, a group of guests leaned together, covering their mouths as they whispered. One woman shook her head slowly, her lips forming words like, "Poor man," and, "What a shame." A man beside her chuckled quietly, glancing at the bride with something between disbelief and mockery. To them, this wedding was entertainment, a strange story to gossip about later. They assumed the bride was unaware, lost in her own silent world. What they didn't realize was that silence had taught her resilience. Every cruel look she had ever endured had shaped her into someone unbreakable. At the end of the aisle stood the groom, the rancher everyone knew and respected. Tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands and a calm, steady presence, he looked nothing like the men who usually sought attention. His suit fit him well, but it couldn't hide the life he had lived working the land. His eyes never left the bride. While others judged her, he saw the woman who had stood by him through hardship, who had listened with her eyes and understood him better than anyone else ever had. He noticed the whispers too. He noticed the glances, and with every mocking smile he saw directed at her, his jaw tightened. The bride's thoughts drifted back to the morning of the wedding. She remembered standing in front of the mirror, adjusting her veil with steady hands. There had been a moment of doubt, a small ache in her chest as she wondered if the world would ever fully accept her. But then she remembered the rancher's smile, the way he learned sign language just to talk to her, the way he never rushed her, never treated her like she was less. That memory had been enough to give her strength. She was not here to prove anything to the crowd. She was here for love. As the guests settled into their seats, the atmosphere grew heavier. Some people smiled politely, others openly judged, and a few looked genuinely curious. The bride stood still, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the moment. She focused on the feeling of the floor beneath her feet, the soft fabric of her dress, the familiar presence of the man waiting for her. In a world that often tried to define her by what she lacked, this moment belonged to her. The officiant stepped forward, clearing his throat, and the room grew quieter. Even then, a few whispers lingered, slipping through the silence like cracks in a wall. The bride lifted her chin slightly, her expression serene. She had faced worse than whispers. She had faced years of being overlooked, of people talking over her instead of to her. None of that would steal this moment away. The rancher took a slow breath, his gaze moving briefly over the crowd before returning to the bride. He could feel something building inside him, a mix of pride, protectiveness, and resolve. He knew the ceremony hadn't truly begun yet, but in his heart, a line had already been crossed. This was not just a wedding. It was a moment of truth. And before the day was over, everyone in that room would understand exactly why this woman stood beside him, not as someone to be mocked, but as someone to be honored. As the ceremony continued, the officiant began speaking, his voice calm and measured, though many in the crowd barely listened. Some guests shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried more judgment than joy. The bride watched the officiant's lips carefully, following every word with practiced ease. She smiled softly at the right moments, her expressions perfectly in sync, though the room around her felt restless and heavy. To her, the silence was familiar, almost comforting, but the tension in the air was impossible to miss. She could sense that this was not a room filled entirely with blessings. When the officiant paused and invited anyone with objections to speak, a ripple of movement passed through the pews. No one stood, but several people leaned forward, eyes gleaming with anticipation, as if hoping for drama. The bride noticed it instantly. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from a quiet readiness. She had spent her life bracing for moments like this, moments when others felt entitled to judge her existence. A few rows back, a young man smirked and whispered something to his companion. The bride caught the movement of his lips and understood enough to feel the sting. His words questioned how she could be a wife when she couldn't even hear her husband speak. Another woman rolled her eyes, folding her arms, clearly unimpressed. The cruelty wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Still, the bride remained composed, her hands steady, her gaze fixed forward. She had learned long ago that dignity was her strongest shield. The rancher, however, was no longer calm. He noticed everything: the snickers, the side glances, the disrespect aimed at the woman he loved. His hands clenched slightly at his sides. He had invited these people to witness love, not to measure it against their narrow standards. For a moment, he considered letting the ceremony continue as planned, ignoring the ugliness. But as he looked at the bride, standing there with quiet grace, something inside him refused to stay silent. The officiant moved on, speaking about commitment and partnership. The rancher barely heard a word. His focus narrowed to the bride's face, to the gentle strength in her eyes. He remembered the nights they had spent talking by lamplight, her hands moving gracefully as she signed her thoughts, emotions, and dreams. He remembered learning every sign slowly, clumsily at first, until communication became second nature. She had taught him patience. She had taught him how to truly listen. And now, watching her being judged by people who had never taken the time to understand her, he felt a deep, burning need to speak. Without waiting for a cue, the rancher stepped slightly forward. The sudden movement caught the officiant off guard and sent a murmur through the crowd. The bride turned her head toward him, surprise flickering across her face. He met her eyes and gave her a reassuring smile, one meant only for her. Slowly, deliberately, he took her hands in his. The room grew still. He began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. As he talked, he faced the crowd, his words clear and measured. He spoke about love not being about perfection, but about presence. About how the bride, though she could not hear, had always understood him better than anyone else. He explained how she listened with her heart, how she noticed things others ignored, how her silence had never been empty but full of compassion and strength. The bride watched his lips, her eyes widening slightly as she realized what he was doing. His words flowed, and with each sentence, her expression softened. She squeezed his hands, grounding herself in the moment. The crowd, once restless, began to shift in a different way. Smirks faded, whispers died out, faces that had been filled with judgment slowly changed to confusion, then curiosity. The rancher didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse or insult. Instead, he spoke with quiet authority, explaining that he was proud to stand beside this woman. That her deafness was not a weakness, but simply part of who she was. That anyone who believed love required sound had never truly understood what love meant. His words carried weight because they came from truth, not anger. As he continued, something remarkable happened. People began to listen, not out of politeness, but because they felt something shifting inside them. A woman who had been mocking earlier lowered her head, her cheeks flushing with shame. The young man who had smirked stared down at his hands. The atmosphere in the church changed, the tension giving way to a heavy, emotional silence. The bride felt tears sting her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Her heart swelled with gratitude and love. She had spent her life defending herself without words, and now, the man she loved was doing it for her, not because she needed saving, but because she deserved respect. In that moment, the ceremony transformed. It was no longer about judgment or doubt. It was about truth, love, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. The rancher's final words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, settling into the hearts of everyone present. For a long moment, no one spoke. The church, once filled with restless whispers and quiet cruelty, was now wrapped in a deep, emotional silence. Even the officiant stood still, his hands clasped, eyes lowered in respect. The bride looked out over the crowd, reading faces as she always had. What she saw now was no longer mockery. It was shock, reflection, and something close to regret. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes, her earlier smirk gone. Another guest swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. The young man who had laughed before shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The rancher slowly turned back to the bride, his expression gentle, his strength now softened by love. He raised one hand and signed a simple phrase he had practiced countless times, "I see you." The bride's breath caught, her eyes filled with tears, and this time she let them fall. She signed back with trembling hands, her movements graceful even through emotion. She told him that his words had reached her deeper than sound ever could. She told him that she had never felt more respected, more loved, or more understood. Those who didn't know sign language still understood the moment. Love needed no translation. The way they looked at each other, the way their hands stayed connected, spoke louder than any voice. The officiant cleared his throat gently, his eyes shining. He resumed the ceremony, but something fundamental had changed. The vows were no longer routine words spoken in front of an audience. They were promises witnessed by hearts that had just been opened. As the rancher spoke his vows, he did so slowly, making sure the bride could read his lips clearly. He promised to always stand beside her, to protect her dignity, and to choose understanding over convenience. Every word was deliberate, sincere. When it was the bride's turn, she signed her vows with confidence. The officiant translated her signs into spoken words, but the emotion was already visible. She promised loyalty, patience, and unwavering love. She promised to walk with him through silence and sound, through storms and peace. Her hands moved with certainty, each sign a testament to her strength. The crowd watched, many openly crying now, moved by the raw honesty of her expression. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted, not in laughter or whispers, but in applause. It started slowly, hesitant at first, then grew stronger, louder, until the entire church was filled with clapping hands and tearful smiles. The bride flinched slightly at the sudden movement, then laughed when she saw the joy on people's faces. The rancher leaned in and kissed her gently, a kiss filled with promise and pride. After the ceremony, guests approached them one by one. Some offered warm congratulations. Others offered something harder but more meaningful, apologies. A woman who had whispered cruelly earlier signed an awkward but heartfelt "sorry," her eyes full of remorse. The bride smiled and nodded, accepting it with grace. She had never needed validation from strangers, but seeing people change, even a little, felt like a quiet victory. Outside the church, sunlight poured over the steps as the newlyweds emerged hand in hand. The world felt brighter, softer, as if the air itself had changed. The rancher squeezed the bride's hand, grounding her in the moment. She looked at him, her smile wide and unguarded. For the first time that day, she felt completely free, free from judgment, free from doubt, free from the weight of other people's expectations. As they walked toward their future, the lesson of the day lingered in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. They had come expecting a wedding. What they had received was a reminder that strength can be quiet, that love does not need sound, and that the most powerful words are sometimes spoken not with a voice, but with courage, respect, and an open heart.